Administrators and religious talk about priests in our schools, right? And I told the team, be honest. So that means being both positive and negative if necessary, constructive criticism. And I think we've got a wonderful team. Dr. Tom Burnford, who is the head of the NCEA, who has in the past year made a noble effort to reground the institution. Many of you priests had less than stellar evaluations of previous incarnations of the organization, and he's charting a renewed course for that. And he came up from DC to be with us today. You met Dean Gillette last night. Charles Taylor is the former superintendent of the Diocese of Gaylord. Stephen Perla is the new superintendent of the Diocese of Fall River. And Sister Agnes is the current chairman of the religion department at Charlotte Catholic High School, and she has spent her whole career in Catholic education. So, Dr. Tom, how did you decide to?
Sure. Why don't we start with you, Charles, and then Sister, and then you go.
No, of course.
And then I'll take that.
Sure.
The idea was that we would talk for no more than 10 minutes each, give our perspectives, and then open up for discussion, if that sounds good to you.
Be careful with Sister, though.
Yeah.
Mark Twain.
Well, good morning, everyone. Most of you met me last night. My background is that I've been teaching for 32 years, beginning this year. Background both in public education and in Catholic education. I've taught at all levels, elementary, middle school, and high school, and I've been a principal at all levels, elementary, middle school, and high school. All of my principalships have been with Catholic schools. And so what I'll talk to you about is that I was serving as the principal of a Catholic high school in Traverse City when I was called to the bishop's residence for Bishop Cooney, who was at that time the bishop of the Diocese of Gaylord. And in the meeting, the bishop told me that the Universal Church needed schools, that they were very, very important, and that he needed me to run the schools for the Diocese of Gaylord. It was a beautiful meeting.
Speak up a little bit more.
It was a beautiful meeting, and a meeting that I'll treasure for the rest of my life. I think I felt very much the call of apostolic succession, and it was very powerful. So I went home, talked to my wife, took the job. But what I found is that on the ground, that my job was very much then going out and convincing the Universal Church of the need for Catholic education in Catholic schools. It was a very weird place to be in. So I think part of what I would throw out right now is that was and I think remains difficult in many places when there's this great call to action at one level, but then when you get into the ground floor of things, it looks very different. Also, at the same time, we're trying to not close schools and deal with issues and problems, and so I would go out, and I never knew what I would find. If I found a very receptive, positive priest who loved evangelization and saw the Catholic school as a powerful tool for that, I was able to do good work on the ground. But if I went out and found a priest who was unconvinced, who did not believe in the evangelization capacity of the Catholic school, or various other problems that would go on, then I had a very difficult problem on the ground. I also would walk around, and I think as an educator could very quickly take notes and find multiple reasons why any school might be closing. And it could be anywhere from a crotchety secretary to an angry custodian to poor education in the classroom. But the blanket that was usually thrown on things was just that, well, the school has low enrollment, it has to close it. And so sometimes the prescriptive remedies for things were difficult, and certainly difficult for a pastor to tolerate. If I would walk in and say, look, not one teacher here knows what they're doing or has the capacity to do what they're doing. What does that mean? What are the ramifications for that? But I was loath to just say, gosh, the school has to close, when I could see that, there were many things that could be done to fix it. So I think in my time, what I found is that there really was no reason for any school to close, that we could be starting schools. There were public schools in northern Michigan, public schools that were operating as one-room schoolhouses. And as I got around to my fundraisers and in the evenings, invariably, every time I was at one of these functions, I would meet a 50, 60, 70-year-old lawyer, doctor, dentist, whatever, philanthropist who was supporting the school, the church, and all of them would shake my hands and would tell me that they were educated in a one-room schoolhouse, even up to and including Archbishop Vigneron, who I ended up standing next to at one point, and asked me, Charles, how are things going in the Diocese of Gaylord? And as I started to tell him about what we were doing with regard to multi-age instruction and some of the things with our schools, he looked at me and he said, well, I went to a one-room schoolhouse. I speak 5 languages and I'm an archbishop, and it doesn't seem to hurt me very much. So I think in my time there, what was difficult was the mixed messages that were out there all over the place, and trying to really get to the heart of how do you cut through a mixed message, how do you get to the truth, and how then do you effectively lead. And so I'm not going to presume to, those were very messy answers in my diocese, and very messy answers in my time on the road. I was there 6 years as superintendent, and just to be clear, I left to have more time with my family. I have a wonderful wife at home of 27 years, and then kids, 5th grader, 7th grader, 5th, 6th, 7th grade boys, and then 2 girls in high school. And all of them are in my classes now. I teach band, and they're all in my class right now. So I have more time with my family, but I'm going to cede the rest of my time. I'm on the clock out here in about 5 minutes, and the reason I want to do this is because as we were talking this morning at breakfast, Sister had some really beautiful insights into all the things that I've just thrown out on the table, how you deal with the messy complications of everything that I've just said. So, Sister, you have my 5 minutes plus your 10.
I feel like I'm in the Senate.
No, we're going to get something. No, Sister, we're going to get something done, though.
That's right. Well, thank you for inviting me here to this forum. I'm grateful for all who organized it, and especially to Father Stravinskas, who has a knack for bringing people together from all over dioceses and disciplines and to talk about Catholic education. So as I was reflecting on what my contribution might be, because while I was delighted to accept it, the topic was not of my choosing. So I sat down about a month ago and began reflecting on the Church's definition of chaplain in Canon Law 564. That states, a chaplain is a priest to whom is entrusted in a stable manner the pastoral care, at least in part, of some community or special group of Christ's faithful, to be exercised in accordance with universal and particular law. Not being a canon lawyer, my catechetical instincts detected confusion for the faithful. Since chaplain, in a non-canonical sense, relates more to a job description. Nonetheless, it is well defined by 2 concepts, stability and pastoral care, that require a disposition commensurate in high school for psychological, emotional, and spiritual needs of a young person. In addition to the challenge of those 2 concepts, and this was mentioned last evening by Father Stravinskas, John Paul II, in instituting the Pontifical Council in Culture, says, the synthesis between culture and faith is a necessity, not only for culture, but also for faith. A faith that does not become culture is a faith that is not fully received, not entirely thought through, and faithfully lived. One does not need to look very far to see how on point he was. It is not the same in all places, so it's good to ask questions. That's what allows us to assess. Do our young believe, and are they willing to open themselves up to Christ, who is their source and end, and in turn give others what they have received? Do our students radiate with the joy of the gospel, which urges them forward in spite of their weaknesses and limitations? Specifically, do we model to our students the unity of faith, or are we selective in applying both Matthew 16 and Matthew 18? On this rock I will build my church. I have given you the keys. In this, Christ established by his own authority a source and an intrinsic reason for unity. In your priesthood, you image the Pope's call to the Church. How you participate in the Pope's call is going to affect how the baptized participate in theirs. They have a right to hear the truth in a timely manner as the Holy Spirit leads us to our final end. Now, certainly Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But as Pope John Paul II reminded priests, to proclaim the good news to all and to practice in a constantly renewed way Christ's perennial command, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, even to the end of the world. So, here's what I might offer to the challenges of our day. I mentioned it earlier, to hand on in a timely way what Christ is entrusting to his apostles, and they in turn hand on by their preaching and writing, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to all generations until Christ returns in glory. Here's a brief review of an important syllogism that would take place in my classroom with different applications. Peter is to Francis as the apostles are to the bishops. In 1978 to 1984, John Paul II gave us his catechesis on human love and the divine plan, also known as the theology of the body. The USCCB website still treats a full outline and commentary under issues and action for marriage and family. I can tell you from personal experience, and it was costly, that the inserting this into high school curriculum beginning in the 1990s was no easy task. But one can see in retrospect the Holy Spirit calling for it. John Paul's motto and life are marked by the totality of this work. From 2005 to February 2013, Pope Benedict called the family to community and participation during an age when virtual reality, he said, had become the young person's only reality. His encyclical Caritas in Veritate is, of course, a teaching document, more precisely, a Catholic social teaching document that gives the moral teachings of the Church to the social and economic challenges of our day. He begins his teaching with James chapter 2, 14 to 18. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Speaking and living the truth in love marked Pope Benedict's life right up to his resignation letter. He writes, this ministry must be carried out not only with words and deeds, but no less with prayer and suffering. However, in today's world, in order to govern the bark of Peter and proclaim the gospel, both strength of mind and body are necessary, strength which in the last few months has deteriorated in me to the extent that I have to recognize my incapacity to adequately fulfill the mission entrusted to me. In his role as Pope Emeritus last Saturday, he offered these words to be read at the funeral of Cardinal Meissner, and said of him, he learned to let go and to live out a deep conviction that the Lord does not abandon his church, even if the boat has taken on so much water as to be on the verge of capsizing. In 2013, Pope Francis, not 2 days into his papacy, was shouting, go forth, adelante, in his Spanish, his mother tongue. In other words, go out and interact, have a personal encounter with the mercy and tenderness of Jesus Christ in the face of our sins. This was not a new Mark 1:15, repent and believe, but a renewed emphasis on how to repent and believe. Because Pope Francis is our current pontiff, there may be a tendency to ignore his words because of his style, or think of ourselves as omniscient. Clearly, the Church has called for a new evangelization to meet the pastoral needs of our time. A visit to the Vatican website one day last week did not disappoint in helping me to make this point. In a brief design of 6 connecting circles, the viewer was brought into a delicate scene of Pope Francis as an acting person somewhere in the world, demonstrating tenderness, mercy, mission, joy, courage, and solidarity. Underneath these 6 frames, a Twitter feed skipped across the page. How beautiful it is to see when young people are street preachers, joyfully bringing Jesus to every street and every corner of the earth. Whoever did this, in my mind, created a sacred moment, expanding two situations on the same level. The faithful who strive to live in the kingdom of God now and see its fulfillment in heaven. And last night, Father Peter Stravinsky mentioned that academia and sainthood are not mutually exclusive. So now many of you are very young and will continue to see this drama unfold because the church will survive us. But it is no small thing to be attentive to the subtle changes in the church. It keeps us rooted in the mission. I believe it is the key in preparing students to be more effective leaders in witnessing to Christ. There's no greater example in human history than the example of Christ. St. Paul writes, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ," 1 Corinthians 11. How we live affects others. We look to others for an example. Others look to us for an example. This happens whether we like it or not. St. Francis, long ago, had an important line for every chaplain. Preach Jesus, and if necessary, use words. And how does this link up to what is happening on the ground of the diocese? Our local ordinary, Bishop Peter Jugas, brought this point home for our graduates this year. The theme of his talk was, what kind of impact will you have on the lives of others as you move forward? He told them, you take with you many great memories from your days here at Charlotte Catholic. There is another thing I would like you to keep in your heart, and that is the promise of Jesus where he says to his disciples and he says to you, behold, I am with you always. He tells them never to forget those words of Jesus as you go in your life's direction. Repeating the promise, I am with you always, even to the end of the world, he underlines that when Jesus gives a promise, he fulfills it. So again, he mentions the consequence of the promise. What kind of impact will you have on the lives as you move forward? Knowing their ability to multitask, the bishop raises it an octave. As you are pondering that, he tells them, there is one more thing I would like you to keep in mind. To remember the excellence of charity and mercy. And make sure you practice these. The bishop knows the goal of holiness and that God is the reward for that holiness. So he put before them one who had attained the heroic virtue of charity and mercy. As a priest, he says, John Paul II was late for Mass on one occasion because he needed the sacristan to loan him shoes for Mass, because he had given his own shoes away to someone poorer who needed them. In 1978, when it came to purchase a ticket to travel to the papal conclave that would elect him as pope, he discovered he didn't have enough money because he had given it all away to the poor. He had to borrow the cash from a friend in order to go to the conclave. Having given them more evidence that the effort is worth it, he adds to the refrain that he asked them to ponder earlier. What kind of impact are you going to choose to have in the lives of others as you move forward and serve the Lord? Bishop Jugas's homily echoed that of a skilled musician. He hit all the notes of the new evangelization. He delivered it with the deep joy of Pope John Paul II. It had the eloquence and complexity of Pope Benedict and the courage so characteristic of Pope Francis. I asked many of the 350 graduates whether they heard the message. One of the band members said it was music to his ears. Dr. Petrock Willie, a brilliant philosopher, theologian, and master catechist, says in his writings very often that the musical instrument metaphor is a parallel between taking up an instrument and taking up Jesus. Harmony and adherence of the faith are the goals and perseverance. Harmony and adherence, I have to get his quote right. Harmony and adherence of the faith are the goals, and perseverance in terms of maintaining and practicing are the means. It is in maintaining, practicing, and professing the faith that has been handed on, which concretely requires a remarkable harmony between the universal and the local church. The chaplain's role, it seems to me, is to reflect that harmony and bearing witness in the church to the gospel of the absolute priority of God. So in the same spirit that our local ordinary addressed the class of 2017, I ask you, what kind of impact will you choose to have in the high school you are assigned or have jurisdiction over? Thank you. I hope that was 10 minutes.
It's hard to follow, sister. I don't know. So good morning again. I was glad to meet almost everybody, I think, last night. So today I just want to talk to you, and I'm an ethnographer. I try to think about how people understand their world. So I can't talk to you today without telling you who I am. So what I have to say comes from 10 years as a Catholic school student. My last year in an all-girls high school taught only by women, half religious, half lay. 12 years as a Catholic school teacher. The parent of a Catholic school student who went to Catholic school from K through 8. And a school board member at my daughter's school for 4 years when I was not happy with the teachers that the principal was hiring. I thought I gotta get in there and make some headway, although I had a great relationship with her. And my first 9 years as a college professor, I began up at the College of St. Rose in Albany when the board was still, I don't know if it still is, almost all made up of the sisters who founded the College of St. Rose. And I came to Seton Hall last year from Chicago. I was born and raised outside of Chicago, but I began my deanship at Northeastern Illinois University, which is a Hispanic serving public university that takes first generation college kids, many immigrants. And so I've spent the last 17 years working in really poor neighborhoods in Paterson, New Jersey, and in Chicago. And my work is built on this whole Catholic foundation that I was born into. And so when Sister talks about those 6 interlocking themes, she's speaking my language. And so in this time, I've worked with priests who have taken a completely hands-off role in the school and left the principal and the teachers to run the place. Or I've also worked with priests who were very involved in the school to the point of firing all the teachers and hiring new ones. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I was the teacher who went to the quinceañeras, who was at the sports events, who did home visits. The conversation we had last night was very apropos to me. How do we begin to show the families we work with who we are as human beings? And that was me. And so I grew up with priests and nuns who were really involved in the life of my family. I was telling our panelists at breakfast, it was normal for me to see priests and nuns at my dining room table. And my mother was a nurse. She was educated in the old days when you got your education in the hospital. So the nuns taught her how to be a nurse. She went to work at Moose Heart, which if you know about Moose Heart, they take kids who have lost their parents, and those people would be at our table. Everybody was at our table. And I think one of the defining moments of my life happened when I was in 2nd grade and John Kennedy ran for president. And so they lined us all up that morning, that Tuesday morning, and they took us to church. And I'm going to talk a little bit about challenging, kids who challenge what's going on. But I raised my hand. Church was out, you had to walk outside to get to church. I raised my hand, I said, "Sister, why are we going to church? It's Tuesday." And she said, "Maureen McDonough, we're going to church to pray to God that John F. Kennedy gets elected president." And I said, "Okay, all right, I can deal with that." But at that night at my dinner table, we had two nuns from school, and my father, who voted for John Kennedy, and my father was a convert, and my mother, who was raised Irish Catholic, who voted for Richard Nixon. And so, I was enmeshed in this environment where what I heard at home was sometimes different than what I was told at school, and I'm going to give you an example. So I was raised by these Irish Catholic grandparents whose only goal was to get us to college. And so my grandfather used to come over on Saturday and we'd have to have all our papers from school and we'd line up and we'd have to show him our papers. And he didn't go to college. He worked to put his brothers through college. And he would study our papers. And I don't really know if he knew the difference between, like if they had a sticker on them or whatever. But at the end of this lineup of the four of us, I was the oldest and we had to go in order, my two brothers and I. And we would then get to go for a treat. And the message was really clear from my grandfather. You do good in school, you work hard, you go to college. And my brothers, I remember, used to cry and say, I don't want to go to college. No one ever told us why we were going to college or what the purpose of going to college was. We were just told from a very young time that we had to go to college. And he also instilled in me, and I spoke to the panelists about this morning, he and my father, that I was strong, I was beautiful, I could do anything I wanted because I was really smart. So no matter what other messages I got in my life, and I got a lot of ones that didn't go along with that, those were the primary things that I carried with me. And so as I began to question certain things in my life, I never lost that feeling that I was strong, I was beautiful, I was smart, and I could do anything that I wanted to. And so I also grew up in a family of religious. So my grandfather's sister, my father was a convert, he was raised Lutheran, and my grandfather's sister became a nun. I'm not sure why, but she was a cloister, and we used to all pile in the car once a semester, and drive up to Milwaukee from Chicago. And before Vatican II, she was behind bars, and I couldn't touch her. But I would write her letters every day, and on the times we would visit, she was an artist, and she used to sew priest vestments and embroider them, and also in the store the nuns had to supplement their living, they would sell items, and she would paint calendars. And so she was a very important person in my life. And the first time she had her jubilee as a nun, the first time we got to touch her, the first time they took down the bars and we got to go outside and have mass and a picnic and we got to hug her. My cousin Mary is still a nun. She's a year older than I am, and my grandfather's brother brought her over from Ireland to be the nanny for one of his kids' families that had 6 kids. And so, this idea that religious people are human has not always served me well, because sometimes, I just think, geez, Father, you're just a guy, or geez, sister, come on, let's go have a drink. And so sometimes I have to be careful here at Seton Hall, because I really have to remember that people play a very different role in their public life. And so I grew up in a family where the religious were part of who we were. And I tell you all this kind of to make a point that if I had my wish list as a teacher and a person who prepares teachers, hopefully for Catholic schools, what would it look like if I combine my personal experiences with my experiences as a teacher? Because as a teacher, it wasn't always the same. I didn't always have the same experience. I grew up with priests in the hallway greeting kids. They knew all our names. They knew my brothers and sisters. They knew my parents. If I was not behaving well and the priest is walking down the hall, said, "Morning, McDonough, do I need to call your mother tonight?" I knew he could call my mother because he knew my mother. In the Catholic schools I worked in, that wasn't totally the case. The priest was seen as the person who said mass, the person who heard confessions. And even though I'm going to tell you the story about firing everyone in a minute, he wasn't involved in the life of the school. And so I do think that the children we taught grew up with a different conception of him than I did as a person who could really make a difference. So my first wish list is that if you're involved with the school, that you know your families and you know their needs and you know what's going on in the world around us. And so having worked in Chicago, in the highest need areas where Catholic schools were still fairly strong, issues of immigration, issues of housing justice, issues of health, mental health and physical health, what was going on in the life of the parishioners was so entrenched in their ability to send their kids to school, to get their kids what they needed, and their faith was built on the fact that they would get the answers to how they could help their own lives, how they could be empowered themselves. And so, you know, I brought a book that's been very important to me, growing up African American in Catholic schools. I don't know if it's still available. But these are all college professors, African American men and women, who were deeply influenced by their life in Catholic schools. And we were talking earlier today, you know, I love arguing with Father Stravinskas, but you know, one of the most controversial figures in Chicago is Father Michael Pfleger. He also has one of the most successful churches in Chicago. And I was telling the panelists, if I wanted to go to church at St. Sabina's and I wanted to go to 10:30 Mass, I would need to be stalking the parking lot so that when 9 o'clock Mass got out, I could run in and get a seat because it was standing room only. And you know, one of the reasons is, whether you agree, disagree, think he's a crazy person, Michael Pfleger understands the life of his parishioners, and he creates an environment in St. Sabina's where the people feel empowered to use religion and to participate in religion as a way to make their lives better. And these are the poorest of the, it's the neighborhood where it's on the news where shootings occur. And so, you know, how is it you understand the life of your neighborhood, who's in your parish, and what their issues are? Secondly, what's your philosophy of education? What do you believe good education is, and how do you enact that? How do you lead? You know, and I wouldn't want the parish priest or the bishop to be micromanaging, but they have to know whether or not what's going on in the school is good education for the children. And so Charles and I were talking about, I'm sure Father Peter is the same, we can tell in 5 minutes walking in a school whether or not it's a good place for kids and it's a good place for learning. And so how do you know whether the teachers are doing what they're supposed to be doing? So the curriculum, the pedagogy, the policies and the practices, the extracurricular activities, the parent and family involvement, how are you going to be a leader in ensuring that all those things are meshing together? So when Father Hiller, his name was, fired all the teachers, it was because he told the story. I was one of the newly hired teachers. He told the story that he gets to the parish, he's assigned to the parish, it has a church, school, and he spent the first 6 months just getting the lay of the land. And he walked up every day, the kids were fighting with each other on the playground. Every day he would see somebody being bullied. Every day there was name calling. Nothing was being done about it. He would walk through the halls and the desks were in rows and the children weren't moving and they were all heads down doing their workbooks. And he thought to himself, how are these kids learning and growing, and what about the environment? Is this what we want for our school? So he fired everybody. I'm not sure I recommend that method, but he did hire everybody using teacher perceiver interview. Again, I don't even know if it's still used, but it's 12 themes around commitment, dedication, that tended to pull teachers. At that point in the school, we had 2 of every grade. The school hired, 16 new teachers who understood the philosophy of student-based, family-involved education. And what a difference. I mean, I stayed there 9 years because it was such an amazing place to work. My next rule is kind of be bold. Be bold in taking action. You may, again, not sure I recommend firing all the teachers, but I think if you know your philosophy, if you know where you want your school to go, if you have a clear vision of what your good school should look like, think about how you're gonna take action to get that, and don't be afraid to take that action. And I'll give you an example, so that we talked about this morning. The Diocese of Rockford, had a teacher evaluation instrument that they, told all the principals they had to use. It was awful, it was terrible, it wasn't helpful, it didn't make better teachers, and so we didn't use it. And so Father had to be behind us in explaining why we weren't using this instrument and why what we were doing was better meeting our needs. And I'm gonna give you one more example. And that is in Chicago, Maria High School, which was run by the Sisters of Mercy, was
St.
very,
Casimir.
St. Casimir, yeah, you're right. They had a hospital and they had a high school. And they were, in general, getting very elderly, getting very on in years, and they decided something had to go. And so they decided to give up the high school. And rather than turn it over to, so Chicago is a smorgasbord of charter providers. What the sisters did was hold an RFP, a request for proposals, for who could run their school. And they interviewed providers, and they chose the provider. They chose Catalyst, which comes out of the Christian Brothers. Catalyst Charter Schools runs only 2 schools total, and they're both in Chicago, an elementary school and a high school. And they agreed that some of the sisters would remain on the board. They agreed to run the school according to the principles that Maria High School had been run under. And they agreed to keep the name, so it's now called Catalyst Maria High School. And the nuns are very much involved still in the life of the school. And some of my former graduates from Northeastern are teaching there as community liaisons. And so, I think it's possible to find solutions. I appreciate what Monsignor said. In many times, some of these charter providers are, in it for the profit and not for the kids. And so, given where we are in this time and space, how do we navigate that? And finally, and maybe my most difficult one, is be willing to be a leader in having the conversation. I told Father Peter once, as a female in the church, as a young female in the 50s, I grew up with a different experience in the church than my brothers did. And so here at home, I was told I was smart, I was beautiful, and I could do and be anything I wanted. But in church, if I said I wanted to be a server, I was told no. And so nobody ever told me why, nobody ever opened the door. And I told the group a story about my daughter. When my daughter went to be confirmed, she wanted to have the confirmation name Martin. She wanted to have the name Martin because my grandfather's sister taught all of us that Saint Martin de Porres was our family's saint, our family's patron saint. I don't know why. But for some reason, she had a big statue of Saint Martin de Porres in the living room. And we would, he was our watch guard, and he was there for our Irish Catholic family. And so on the day when her husband died, she called my daughter over and she said, look, the crack in the statue healed up on this day that your Uncle Emery died. And so this is a miracle, it's a sign that St. Martin is really for us and he's gonna protect you. So when it came time to be confirmed, Father was teaching religion, the parish priest, he taught religion once a week to the 7th graders, and he told her no, you can't have a boy's name. There's no way you can have a boy's name for your confirmation name. You could have Martina, throw an A on the end, but you can't have Martin. No explanation. So she came home crying. She said, Father won't let me have Martin. What am I gonna say to Grandma? Father won't let me have Martin. I said, write a letter and let's go talk to him. And so we went to the principal first and we got a workaround. But I will say that one of the issues is, how do we open the door to difficult conversations with our students? For me, the priest is a leader in that, because there are many societal issues, there are a lot of conundrums in the church, and so how do we bring these issues to the fore for kids so they don't get turned off? They're not just told, no, this is how it is. That we bring them through the faith, through the reasoning, through the discussion, and we're not afraid to have those conversations with kids. So, I'm gonna end there, I'm probably over my 10 minutes, but I do wanna give one commercial. You're gonna hear from Connie McHugh tomorrow, I think, about our Catholic School Leader Program for teacher development and teachers who wanna be principals. I've instituted the tagline, Seton Hall, we put the Catholic in Catholic school leadership, having looked at many school leader programs that have nothing to do with Catholicism. So I hope you'll consider sending some of your teachers to us. We're starting it online, we hope, in January. So if you're not from here, you can still take advantage of it.
Okay, very good. Well, prior to sharing my observations, I'll just give you a very quick overview of my personal background. I've been in Catholic education for 30 years. Prior to that, I served in elected office for 12. And my experience in the Catholic Church and in Catholic education in particular, I've been a Catholic teacher. In addition to that, I've been in a variety of educational leadership positions. I, for 7 years, led the ACE Consulting at the University of Notre Dame. It was an international consulting firm that worked with Catholic schools that the university had put together a number of years ago, and I was its first leader. And in addition to that, for many, many years, I have led public policy efforts on behalf of Catholic schools for the state of Massachusetts. And so you can kind of see I have a great love for both Catholic education and public policy. That really has been sort of my field and my passion and my interest. In reflecting on the topic at hand, first to set a context, I think it's very important that our priest be very much involved and be a leader of our Catholic schools. And I do believe it starts with the bishop, because the bishop has to be, in fact, both a leader and support of Catholic education, and has to encourage his priests to do so. And also, as he makes assignments to the various parishes where we in fact have Catholic schools, he has to look at that personnel question: does that priest really want to be involved in a Catholic school? Unfortunately, I know for a fact that we have so many priests that do not want to be part of a parish that has a Catholic school because they see it as an albatross. They don't see it as an opportunity to really evangelize and to bring, I think, a lot of young families into the church. However, we're very blessed that we do have a number of priests who in fact welcome that opportunity and see the importance of the ministry. And when you think about a Catholic school, it has to be all about the mission. And if it's going to be a Catholic school, first of all, we're a sacramental church. And as you know, the source and summit is the Eucharist. And who in fact can do that is our priest. And so without a priest, we don't really have a Catholic school. Because if we're really truly Catholic, you have to make that connection to the sacraments. We're a sacramental church. Beyond that, I think the priest is so critical in a Catholic school in terms of his witness. You know, it constantly reminds both the educators, the students, as well as the families, that this really is about mission. It is about Catholicism, and our goal really is to pass on the faith to the next generation. And I think most of us know in our church today, in this country, we have a lot of challenges with that. And I think, unfortunately, when you look at religious education, because of the model, the limited time that we have, they just don't have the same opportunity that you can have in a Catholic school to be able to pass on the faith. And really, I think, for those kids involved, really give them a sense of who Christ is and how Christ can play a very important role in their lives. The other piece, clearly, is vocations. Where do most of our vocations come today? If you look at the most recent CARA studies, clearly, if it wasn't for Catholic schools in this country, we wouldn't have the number of priestly and religious vocations that we have. We wouldn't even have the mass attendance, although in a lot of places abysmal, that we have. And we wouldn't have the level of contributions to the church. Because as you look at the data, it is very clear that our Catholic schools have considerable impact in terms of all those areas. And you know, in the last couple of statements that our bishops have made in this country, both in 1990 as well as in 2005, in those statements, as they address Catholic education, Catholic schools in particular, they very much pointed out the importance of the role of the priest, most especially the pastor of a parish that has a Catholic school. That they really have to be called to leadership and commitment in those areas. And I can tell you, as a superintendent of schools, and as someone that has advised over 150 dioceses across this country, that a school can either thrive or, in fact, implode, all based on the priest leadership if it's a parish school. It is that critical. And I'm not in any way being dramatic. You just need to look at the data. And so your leadership, for those of you that are currently priests and for those of you that are looking to be priests, it is so critical that you understand the impact that you have on those families and in particular those kids' lives as you lead those parishes with schools. I think it's so important that I'm going to just describe for you a few models that have been developed over time that I've had some direct involvement with, just to give you some ideas. So when I was superintendent in a previous diocese, we had a parish school and we had a pastor who did not enjoy being a pastor of a Catholic school. And he was very honest about it. It wasn't a secret. He was very honest about it. And there were times in which that displeasure got manifested in the way he responded to kids. And one day I probably got 5 or 6 calls from families at that particular parish and at that school who were very upset because the pastor had swore at the kids. And so I went to the bishop. It's above my pay grade. I can't do any kind of transfer, and it's not my job to do personnel pieces as it relates to the priest. And I went to the bishop, who's a great guy, and I had a conversation with him, and I said, Bishop, we have this situation at the school, and, we're going to have people leaving. The school was already at a critical moment. And to give you a little more context, the school's demography in terms of its neighborhood had completely shifted. At one time, it was primarily Canadian French. It was now a very large Hispanic population in that neighborhood, and the school did not in any way reflect the neighborhood. And I happen to know of a young priest that had just got ordained, maybe about a year and a half ago, who was Latino, had a lot of energy, dynamic. And I said to him, Bishop, would you ever consider having a chaplain at an elementary school if the pastor were to agree to it? I know it's an unusual model. We usually have chaplains at high school levels. But I think, one, the families are starving to have that pastoral care and to have someone in a leadership position, as a chaplain in this case, who can really serve the families and the students. Beyond that, I know that this particular priest is very involved in the neighborhood. He might be able to begin to work with us to increase enrollment and to really have the school begin to serve a population that is in fact living right outside its doors. And I didn't know what he was going to say to this. And give me a few days to think about it, Steve. I'll pray on it and I'll get back to you. And he did. And he said, yes, we're going to go with it, Steve. I want you, to have an initial conversation with the pastor, just kind of, lay out the idea, see how he responds, and I will have a follow-up conversation. Much to that pastor's credit, he was very supportive of the idea, because you can't do this, obviously, because that's his parish. You gotta respect that, unless you have his support, otherwise it's not going to work. And as I said, to his credit, he embraced the idea because he felt at this point that, as he perceived, a burden would be lifted from him, and this would now be both sacramentally, as a faith leader, this person's responsibility. And fortunately also, the person that I had identified, the bishop felt would be a good role for him, and agreed to do it. And so we went ahead and implemented the model. And it had tremendous impact because the families were thrilled because now we had a priest in the school building. He was teaching religion, he was saying mass, he had a great, presence, and he also was visiting families in the neighborhood. We began to get some enrollment for that school. It just had an incredible impact in terms of the school's life and its long-term vitality. And there's a model where, as I look at challenges, if you have those situations, I think it's important to sort of think outside the box. How can you address this, working within the framework in which we have to work in, and making sure clearly that the people who need to make decisions embrace the model that you're pursuing. But I found it as a solution to a pretty serious problem, and I'm convinced that if we didn't take that action step, that we probably would have lost that school in a year or two. An example of a chaplain at an elementary school, and I've used it in other places where we have similar situations, and I have found typically if a pastor is reticent to be involved in the school, that they're open to looking at that type of help. On the other hand, I think more and more bishops are becoming much more attuned to trying to identify priests who want the school, which makes a significant difference. That's really the best model, is to have a pastor who really wants the school in his parish. I have to say that I've come full circle on this. You know, I have become more convinced that if you have a parish school where you have a supportive pastor, that is probably the best model in terms of Catholic education. And I say that as someone who did not necessarily believe that was the best model 5 years ago. But I think when it works well, from an evangelization point of view, from the point of view of having a real integration of the school and the church, and what you can do with that is just incredible. I think there's a lot of potential. Although we got to look at other models, because the parish model is not the only model. In a diocese you have variety, but I think that is a really strong model when it works well. The second one that I want to share with you is a model where in a area where you might have a parish school, elementary, and a secondary school that might even be diocesan. If you have a priest that is really supportive of Catholic education, another model that I find rather interesting is having that priest serve as the chaplain from elementary through high school. And what that does is, if you have a really effective priest who's going to take that on as part of his ministry, it really makes an impact, because he really, to Maureen's point, gets to know the families, he gets to know the kids, and from so many different perspectives, he can be so impactful in those people's lives. And they get to know him, and they get to trust him. And it makes a real difference, even for vocations, because over that extended period of time, you get to know who might in fact have a sense, who might be someone that would like to serve the church. And it's a great way, I think, to develop very good relationships. It's also a great way, I think, to re-evangelize and to evangelize, because this priest who is now serving across multiple grade levels, the families get to know him. They get to see him, they understand who he is, and it can really have an impact. I have seen that model work as well. And the thing I will say is, and I've said this to the bishops that I've served, is that we have such a shortage of priests, and we have such a shortage of vocations. And I realize we have such a need in our parishes. But when you look at the CARA data, when you look at how important Catholic schools are, it is so critical that we have a priest presence in our high schools. It's critical we have at the elementary level, but it's just as critical, and probably more critical when it comes to vocation development, that we have them in our high schools. And unfortunately, because of the shortage, oftentimes we don't get that kind of resource. I recognize highly unlikely you're going to get a full-time priest assigned as, the chaplain of the high school. But it is important to have someone that really is excited about it, enthusiastic about it, and really wants to do that kind of work. The last model, and we're in the development stage of this, and maybe some of you might have comments about this as we discuss this over time, is we are trying to more intentionally develop a evangelization model with our Catholic schools. I know of many incidences where kids have brought their families back to church. And you can cite those examples. I don't think, though, we've done a good enough job in doing that intentionally. And so right now, we're thinking through developing a program which will allow us to really do this in an intentional way, which of course, in this case, the priest becomes critical in that whole evangelization effort. And some of the ways we're looking at this is how do we involve the families with their kids? So how do we create those moments in which we have families come to the school or to the parish church, where we have liturgies and different celebrations, and really look at that as a moment where we can in fact reach out to families and invite them. What I have found in some of the data is that oftentimes the reason why parents are not back at church is because they may have irregular marriages. And it may be as simple as they're divorced. You'd be surprised how many people think because you're divorced, not remarried, because you're divorced, you're cut off from the sacraments. Those irregular marriages, is pretty high in terms of data when you start looking at some of the information. And just having a sense of that, again, knowing your families and being able to invite people back. I mean, I had a cousin of mine who hadn't received communion for years because she was divorced. And I said to her, I said, we've never been married. I don't know what your, I can't. I said, I can't do that. But I know that even in my dealings with families in schools, oftentimes there's that confusion that exists. And you might have situations where you can help families through annulments. My point is, we're looking at a variety of ways in terms of, one, creating those moments where we have family involvement. We're looking at ways in which we can try to help resolve maybe family issues that might be a barrier to them attending church or going back to the full life of the church. We're also looking at ICA type model for those that may not have received all the sacraments as an adult. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can do this, but the priests are going to be critical in that effort. And the metric we're going to have to use over a period of time is, have we really, in those places that we've tried this, have we really increased church attendance? Has the life of the parish become more vibrant? And again, the priest is so critical in the leadership he's willing to provide in those instances. I mean, I think today we have to have a missionary zeal. The reality is people aren't coming to us. And the reality is we have to outreach to them. And I see our Catholic schools as a vehicle to do just that. And we should not be shy about this. The whole purpose of our Catholic schools is to pass on the faith. I think sometimes we become very shy about that. I mean, oftentimes we're more willing to cite the data around how many non-Catholics we have, which I'm perfectly comfortable with, but that becomes more the emphasis as opposed to how many families are we bringing back to the church as a result of the work that we're doing in our Catholic schools. I think we have to begin to think about the role of the schools and how it in fact can strengthen our church. And it's not so much about the church, it's about those souls who hopefully we are in fact impacting and saving as they go forward. In closing, I'd like to say, at the university, at ACE, I thought we had a wonderful way to capture this. We've always said that the purpose of the Catholic school is to prepare kids for college and for heaven. And I really believe that's the purpose of our Catholic schools, is to prepare kids for college and for heaven, which I think nicely summarizes where I think the Catholic school should be.
Great. Thanks for everybody. My pleasure to be here. My name is Tom Burnford. I'm currently the President and CEO of the National Catholic Education Association, a membership association supporting Catholic schools in the United States. 6,400 Catholic schools, serving 1.9 million students across the country. I'm from England originally. I came here when I was 18 out to high school. Was involved with charismatic renewal, encountered the Lord, which transformed my life. I did a couple of degrees, an MDiv, and that sort of thing, and worked in a parish as DRE, had a girl, got married, had some children, and have spent 30 years working either in a parish or for the Archdiocese of Washington. Most recently passed for 10 years as Secretary for Education for Zenith's Cardinal World. And in those 30 years, a great joy of mine has been working with pastors. Particularly working with pastors at difficult times involving Catholic schools. I'd like to just very briefly talk about something from here, Evangelii Gaudium from the Holy Father, the opportunity the pastors have in working with schools, and then sort of make that a little practical with an example, if I may. So the Holy Father says, I dream of a missionary option that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything. So the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably challenged for the evangelization of today's world rather than her self-preservation. This I find obviously very challenging to look through the lens of mission in everything we do. And I would suggest that applies to that ministry of the parish that is the Catholic school, referring mostly to parochial schools. And then the Holy Father goes on to say the parish is not an outdated institution. Well, of course not. But then he says why? Precisely because it possesses great flexibility. It can assume quite different contours depending upon the openness and missionary creativity of the pastor and the community. I feel like the Holy Father is saying that parishes and therefore schools have an option. And that option is to serve their local community and evangelization in a way that best fits that local community. And therefore the role of pastor is absolutely essential because it's the pastor's role to take care of the people in his geographical souls in his care. And he has flexible instruments to do it. Now those instruments, be it parish or school, are flexible only to the degree that the pastor and the principal and the teachers of school and the community want that community to be flexible. And therefore much time is spent in changing culture, is it not, in parishes, and how we look at what we do, whether we are outward focused, inward focused, whether we are focused on evangelization or preservation, whether we wish to grow or maintain. These are the questions that we face. The nice thing is that the very structures of church are set up that the missionary option can be implemented through that flexibility. So where does that work, right? And really what we're talking about, in Catholic schools, you've got 36 hours where a young person is in an environment designed for them to have an encounter with the Lord and learn the faith. So where does this come from? And I would suggest practically, one thing I just wanted to mention, and this is where a lot of my work was with pastors in Washington. When we read this, the Holy Father respects the dignity of every human person. And he does that very clearly, I think, firstly, by listening to those encounters, and then responding authentically, person to person. He doesn't set himself above other people. He respects the dignity of every person created equal as a child of God. If you take that to its logical conclusion, and you're a pastor who has a school, you could face a situation where, I don't know, I'm curious to know if anyone's faced this, where you wake up at 2:30 or 3 in the morning, worried about your school. Right? Has anyone ever done it? Chances are you're worried about the finances of your parish school. You woke up early in the morning worried about it? No? Do you know that sort of feeling, right? You're responsible for something. I'm responsible for an office with 30 bodies in it. I wake up at 3:30 in the morning and I worry about it. You know what? I'm paid to do that. Okay? That's my job, to worry about that. If you're a pastor with a parish or a school, you've got a $250,000 deficit and your offertory is going down and your enrollment's going down, you better be worrying about it. The question then becomes, are you the only one waking up at 3 in the morning worrying about it? So my proposition to you is, if everybody has the same dignity, if all people are created with dignity, then leaders, pastors, have a responsibility to communicate whatever's going on with the people in the parish and the parents in the school and engage them in fixing the issues the school might face. So you have two scenarios. You have Catholic schools that announce they're closing in June, right? They're on, if you have Google alerts set for Catholic education, Catholic schools, you'll see them now. And then the community gets in an uproar, goes to the media and saying, why are you, Father or Big Bad Diocese, closing our schools in June? My friends, I think that is wrong. I think that reflects a community or a system that has not engaged the stakeholders, the people of God, in whatever issue is current in that school and engage them to help address that situation. The worst thing one could ever hear, and I've only heard it once, is if the church had told me about this problem, I would have done something to help. Now, if you think about it, there's potentially a salvific ramification to not communicating with people what's going on in your school, honestly and openly, because they're angry at the church that's the source of their salvation. So my proposition is, when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning worried about your finances, okay, make sure that everybody in your community knows. Share the finances, the enrollment, the demographic shifts, the academic performance, and everything there is to your school community. Okay? When you send out a bill for your school tuition assistance, say this is the cost, right? We're spending $8 grand on your child. We're charging you $6.5. That's a $1,500 gap. Please thank these people who are making it up, whether it's the parish. Give a financial report for the school. Your diocese probably says you have to, therefore you don't want to, but do it, right? Because people need to know. And if you get in trouble, engage the community. My friends, when you tell the community that there's a problem, they're going to get upset, right? And that's okay. If you tell them in a timely manner, they will be nowhere near as upset as if you hold it in, which would probably make mistakes. Hold it in and don't tell them until it's too late for them to do anything about it. Communicate, collaborate, consult. If you've got an issue, tell the people. Tell them out front. Tell the truth. His Eminence Cardinal Moore phrases it this way: it is charitable to tell the truth. We have to come clean with how our parishes and schools are run, share the finances, the demographics, and the challenges. We actually have 25 in Washington. There's 25 pages of protocol on how to do that. 3 o'clock you meet with the faculty. 6 o'clock you meet with the advisory bodies in the school and the parish. 7 o'clock you have a full parish meeting with PowerPoints explaining demographics. You do this when you know your school's going to be facing serious challenges. But you know what? You do it 2 years before you think your school might be facing challenges, and you will build community because the people in this community are interested in calling your children. So that's just a practical piece that I would share with you. The only other element is just to reiterate, we have an opportunity nowadays, I think, to look at everything we do as church from the missionary option. I'm really intrigued as what that means. I think there's huge potential. I see Catholic schools as tools of the new evangelization, of instruments of evangelization. Therefore, they're places where pastors, principals, and teachers witness the faith, not just teach, but witness and catechize the faith to young people who need an encounter with the Lord. And in that process, everybody grows. Anyway, thank you. Oh, please pay your dues and see it.
How are they doing? Do you want to give an update on those?
Oh, yeah. No, we're good.
Just put it up front.
We're doing, yeah, absolutely. We have 5,600 out of 6,400 schools who pay their dues for NCA, which is pretty good right now. So, yep.
Questions, comments? Father?
First of all, Dr. Burnford, in addition to loving to hear your accent, I like what you said about the flexibility. And I'd like to throw this open to the panel. The Diocese of Pittsburgh is currently looking at new options. We are in a two-pronged, On Mission for the Church Alive is the title of it. It's going to consolidate every parish with neighboring parishes. So our parishes are currently going to go down from 189 to 49 as the plan looks. So all the priests are in in turmoil right at the moment. The schools are the other portion of that. All of our schools practically are de facto regional schools. Nobody has a school with only your own parishioners in it. We've been looking at how a pastor deals with his flock. And that's wonderful, but that's not the reality anymore. As I understand it, and I don't think they've kept us quite as up to date with the schools aspect as with the parishes that we've had to work with. But every school is going to be part of a region. In each region, the basic administration, there will be a regional administrator, there will be a regional bookkeeper, fundraiser. Each school will have its own principal and be autonomous in that regard, but they'll do all the purchasing in a regional sense, and will be ruled by a board of pastors. And one pastor, or perhaps a parochial vicar, will be connected with each school. So obviously we're looking at creating a new reality. And with the new reality for the priests, I'm hoping to be able to say, I want something where I can be involved in the schools. And the last time I was transferred, the clergy personnel director said to me, well, we know we have to put you in a parish with a school. So I'm thankful that they're recognizing that. But I mean, going into that, do you have any thoughts on how we can continue that Catholic identity, how we can continue to make it, how can we make this work?
So, if I may, there are a number of models out there where you have shared jurisdiction and leadership over Catholic schools. And the worry, of course, is always in terms of how do you maintain strong Catholic identity when you don't have a pastor living next door who is actively engaged in the school, right? So that's a common question. Therefore, you see, for example, you see times where the Archdiocese will creatively and with the people develop standards for Catholic identity in this school and train people to use those effectively. So that we'll talk more about what does it mean to be Catholic, as opposed to assume that it will just be infused because there's religious all over the school as there were 30 years ago. So I think you can do a lot through policy. We can also do a lot through accreditation. And then, of course, you want to maximize the presence of priests and religious in the school. The next piece, therefore, is to say, what does it mean to form, not educate, not train, to form Catholic school teachers? The challenge there is formation of a Catholic school teacher really means forming them as a missionary disciple. Forming them as a missionary disciple means that you understand, right, whether you are assuming conversion or not. Okay, because it's pretty hard to witness if you haven't encountered the Lord, right? And for too long we've assumed that everybody who works in the church, Catholic school teachers, right, has had an encounter with the Lord and therefore can authentically witness. So that's a sort of precursor. We got to get clear on the assumptions we make about where people are at, so that we're not starting at the wrong level. Those are just a couple of thoughts. There are various models around the country of consortium and structures where people have come together from, extreme separation from ecclesial structures, as in Philly with the Faith in the Future Foundation, a bunch of business guys running 19 high schools, to more in-house or, run by pastors and diocesan groups, but funded externally, like Big Shoulders, to a consortium in Washington, D.C. that's a hybrid. Fatica has written up many of these models in a book. I can't remember the title now, but it's on their website. Fatica publishes a book that lists all the different types of models.
If I
Father,
could
we
weigh in.
had a bishop that was very strong in Catholic schools, but he fiercely opposed the idea of regional schools because he said nobody takes ownership of that school. He said it's just out there floating. And as an example, we created a regional model. There were different campuses for our center city schools. and it didn't work. I guess if you wanna find out what didn't work, just ask Indianapolis, somebody can tell you. So what did he do? Okay, if you had three parishes, St. Peter, Paul, and Mary, and St. Peter and St. Paul closed the schools, the kids would go to St. Mary's School, but it was St. Mary's School, it wasn't a regional school. Because he said if there's not a pastor living next door, or really responsible, he said nobody takes responsibility. And I think there was some wisdom to that. Although I'm sure there's probably places where a regional model has worked well. But it probably has to do with the personalities.
Just to piggyback on that, I understand that there are some circumstances in which a regional model is necessary. But I firmly believe that the parochial model is still the most effective. And Monsignor's point about ownership, not simply that the priest is in charge, but that the people believe that this is their school. And it's not simply a matter of, St. Cunegunda's school where kids come from all over the place and the building happens to be on this property. The pastor doesn't have a sense of ownership of it. The people don't. And the kids are not connected to any ecclesial reality beyond the school. New York adopted a massive regional policy a couple of years ago. And let me tell you, it is a consummate disaster, right? And in fact, some of the regionalized schools, after 5 years, are now closing themselves. So I think we've got to bite the bullet and say, at all costs, let's try to maintain the model that really has worked. And again, allowing for the possibility that there may be circumstances where you want to do something else. But I think Brooklyn started this clustering thing when I was a seminarian, beginning my graduate work here at Seton Hall in education. And they called it clustering of schools. And it was about 1974, 75. 5 schools will, quote, cluster into 3. And as a 20-year-old seminarian, I had the wisdom to say, my guess is in 5 years, the 3 will cluster into 1. And 5 years later, the 1 will have to cluster with the 1 3 miles away. And sooner or later, we're going to find that the parishes are clustering, which of course is exactly what has happened. And so both Brooklyn and New York have been engaged in this process for a very long time. And it's now Brooklyn has no parish schools whatsoever. Everything is an independent academy. And the priests will tell you, in New York, the priests rebelled tremendously against the regionalization process. And it wasn't simply that they wanted to be the jefe. It was they knew the story on the ground and they knew it was going to work, but people in the power tower thought they knew better. And it really has not been successful.
Does NCEA keep data on that?
100 schools closed last year, 96. So not specifically on that. Most of those schools will be independent, will be parish schools.
Because in Chicago, they began clustering a couple years ago. And just because one of my colleagues was on the school board and, was in one of the parish schools that was clustering, we know that a number of students just left and went to the public school because they weren't gonna travel, they weren't gonna move. I mean, it's the reason I moved from 9th grade to the public school in 10th grade, because way back then in 1967, the all-girls school merged with the all-boys school. And I'm like, I'm not going to school 6 miles away, so I'll just go to public school, which is 3 blocks away. And so, I think there must if we're not, we should be keeping data on how many kids are lost on this trajectory of closing. It may be too late now in Pittsburgh, so I was gonna say, okay, so let's say it's too late, this is happening. Is there still a room for policy where if you have a regional cluster, the priests from each of those parishes can be involved in the governance of the school?
Philadelphia, the Independence Mission Schools, which are the inner city grammar schools, have a model that I think has been rather successful. And their enrollment has actually increased, in fact, almost doubled in 5 years. But that's a very, very different situation, because what you're dealing with in most of those inner city schools is a largely non-Catholic population of the students. And so those kids would not be involved in the life of an individual parish anyway. I think that's an entirely different issue.
So we know that since the year 2000, the enrollment in Catholic schools has declined by about 30%. Okay, since the year 2000, so precipitous decline, and also the number of schools there. However, we do not have research to suggest that is, quote, because of regionalization, right? You regionalize because schools are failing, right? And you have to cluster. Schools are failing because, you know, I mean, I'm not going to answer the question as to why schools are failing. In the same sense, I'm not going to answer the question as to why mass attendance has shifted and declined, and why, in one sense, you know, we're losing. We got to read this to figure out that one.
It'd be interesting to know of the 96 that closed, how many of those were already consolidated schools?
I think though, when you look at governance, and specifically as you look at governance as relates to Catholic identity, the thing that you have to think about is, like in any organization, somebody has to be in charge. And I think the model that you're describing, Father, the thing you might run into is if you have 4 or 5 pastors that are on a board trying to share that, nobody really is in charge. And in any type of organization, I've never seen it work when you have shared governance like that, when nobody is really in charge and asked to, in fact, be responsible for it. I think that's the critical piece.
And I think we have to be honest enough to admit that this myth of the monolithic Catholic Church has been blown apart for 40 years. And in many ways, we're like New York Jews. They say, you put 10 Jews in a room, you get 11 opinions. And that's the case with ecclesiology today, unfortunately. But if you put 5 pastors on a board, and 3 of them are liberal Anglicans, 1 is a traditionalist Catholic, and this is all confusion, twice confounded. And so what is the common vision that you have? There is no common vision.
But that's a question, and so maybe I'm naive. So I don't mean 4 people should run the school, because you have a regional director. But how do you bring people together in the beginning to talk about what's the vision and to hash it out? Because as long as that's not hashed out, as long as there's, and everyone's not gonna agree, but getting people at the table to talk about what are we doing, where are we going, what's our mission, what's our vision, like it's peril to not, I think it's peril to not do that when you're putting together, if you're stuck in this situation, to me, it's almost the first step is to say, bring a meeting of the minds, because otherwise people will never work together. Then the whole, in my view, the whole thing's gonna fall apart anyway, because everybody's going in with their own. Oh, hi.
Same thing I got.
Right, so,
He just did it, it worked.
okay, so, this is my associate dean, Joe Martinelli, we're still trying to solve this, where'd Paul go?
I have no idea.
Okay, so I'm gonna put this,
Is that here?
at the break, I'll talk with him, we'll get it figured out. Everybody, we have all the.
The other
numbers.
issue, the other issue is with the parochial model. For the past 30 years, we have essentially, our parishes have become Anglicanized, by which I mean people go to a parish now not because they live in that zip code, but because they like Father's liturgy or whatever. And so there's peace generally in a parish right now because people are there because they agree with whatever that particular priest is doing. And so if you have the parish school, there's already a self-selecting process that has existed. When you start moving beyond that, then you're going to the fighting is going to start all over again the way it did 40 years ago. I think that's the difficulty.
Another thing, even about location, I was resident in a parish that kind of turned Hispanic over, a short period of time. And the school was full, was crowded, really. And the public school 3 blocks away closed. And we said, well, let's buy that building. It's 3 times bigger than ours, and 3 times nicer, although it was falling apart, and move the school there. Well, they did it. We did it. They did it. But the population did not associate the school with the church, and eventually they moved back. to the old building. Because there was that disconnect in the minds of people, at least those people, that they weren't connected. It was only 3 blocks away.
See, I think another successful approach that can be used is never close a school as such. If there's going to be a merger, keep as many of those buildings operative as possible, but move, in other words, pre-K to 1 and 2 in this building, 3, 4, 5 there, 6, 7, 8 in another place. First of all, then no one feels a sense of loss. And secondly, it is a unified system, but everybody has a stake in something because there is still the building that's present there. And as Catholics, we're an incarnational religion. Structures mean something. I mean, the first thing the church did when she moved out of the catacombs was build churches and schools. And I mean, that's just a part of who we are. And so to be shy of the building, I think is a myopic approach to things.
There are many of those structures, like Father's talking about, the Diocese of Gaylord, Father's aware of many of them, but there still exists the difficulty when you put 5 pastors together and have them, or 4, and have them govern. Just, it's like Monsignor said, terribly, terribly difficult. I mean, you send in a layperson to try to moderate that situation, it's very, very challenging. So I'd still say that the best, with my recollection, is what Steve was saying. If I could keep a school open with 60 kids, K-8, there's lots of places we're able to do that by just doing less teachers, more kids instead of the other way around. That still ended up being the best parochial, like what Steve was saying, the parochial model. That pastor is there, hiring the right teachers to do the right job. Not that regionalization doesn't maybe have to happen in some places, but it's very, very difficult when you get a number of people trying to govern something. It's really, really challenging.
I think even though you have a regional director, I think what you gotta be cautious about is the Catholic identity piece. The regional director can handle the budget matters and things of that sort. But you know, if the Catholic identity is not strong in the school, that really has an adverse impact. I mean, I know of a school in another diocese in our state that just closed that was very robust, but they had some change in pastors, had a change in principal. And I was asking my pastor, I said, what happened to that school? They used to have like 250 kids in it. It was elementary, it was pretty good. He said, well, see, they got a new principal. I couldn't believe this, that they went down to teaching religion 1 day a week. And the parents were saying, why are we sending our kids here? And even though I realized that for many parents today, that's not the first reason why they send their kids to our schools. However, the reality is it is on the run, that people like the fact that their kids are in a Catholic school setting. They like the fact they're learning what they would consider morals. And for many, they also, of course, want the faith to be taught. But my only point is, there was a school that completely imploded as a result of losing its Catholic identity. And, you know, you can have the school operating, but the Catholic identity is the only reason why we're there. And so I think I'd be worried about Pittsburgh, Father, is if you're gonna have a regional model, I think the question to raise is, who really is the faith leader of those particular schools? I mean, I think that is critical. Who's responsible for that component of it? I think, and I think Tom's point of the policies and all that are very important. I think it goes to division and all that has to be worked out. But I think at the end of the day, somebody has to be responsible for leadership in the Catholic identity piece.
So that you just, can I just respond to that, Bishop?
Sure.
Actually, you wanna go?
No.
Hey, just,
Yeah.
because here's an interesting point, right?
Yeah.
We've been talking about Catholic identity for a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, and I work for Cardinal World. I wrote the Archdiocese policies on Catholic identity, right? And you can get them for free at Washington. So I know Catholic identity. The Holy Father's talking about missionary discipleship. Which are we going to focus on? And just throw that out, because this says missionary discipleship. And I'm trying to figure out what the heck that means. And I believe that Catholic schools have a role in that. Okay, because I've been talking Catholic identity for years and years. And yes, it's critical. You can't evangelize without it. There's got to be something different going on with this concept of missionary discipleship.
I would agree with that, Tom. I don't disagree with that.
Bishop?
Yeah, and then there's the cultural issue. You referred to it yesterday once when we were talking about the secularization problem. And the issue that, for example, the brighter lights up in New England speak of the fact that the Northeast and the whole West Coast, Catholics really are secular Catholics. And therefore, so the horizon is simply an acceptance of a lot of the issues that come out in modern crisis and anthropology issues. Because we no longer have, for example, I worked in humanism from the time I was a young priest. And we always had, beginning our conversations, there was an agreement that we lived according to a Judeo-Christian anthropology. We are made created in the image and likeness of God and so on. We no longer have that. We don't have it in the ecumenical dialogues. And so therefore, we could talk all we want about the mystery of the Trinity or the order of the sacraments, but we have no agreement on what is human nature. And this is a huge, huge problem. And it's what creates the same problem that we find within our own community. So that the identity issue is central to working out. And then the other thing that Tom mentioned before that's so important is, so how are we going to work in the formation of the teachers? Because that's one of the most difficult things. If we have, for example, everyone's telling us, yeah, well, in the Northeast and in California, we're secular. Secular Christians are not evangelizing Christians. And so therefore, or if they're evangelizing Christians, if they have a mission, it's not a mission related to what the church has understood itself to be from our beliefs.
Well, we have a book available through our Newman House Press called Restoring a Catholic, Maureen, what does it say? No, next one. Recovering a Catholic philosophy of Catholic elementary education. It's a misnomer, it really shouldn't say elementary, it's Catholic education, period. But when we published that book, it's done by Dr. Curtis Hancock from, what's the Jesuit University in Kansas City? It'll come to me. At any rate, when he published that, what's that? Rockhurst, that's it, yeah. When he published that, when we published it, we were told it was the first textbook of Catholic philosophy of education in English in 40 years, all right? And to the bishop's point, we put discussion questions at the end of every chapter that deal with what is the cultural presumption of the teachers. Now, I recommend that pastors and principals get this book and use it with their faculties. Read a chapter a month as a faculty, and instead of talking about attendance procedures at the next faculty meeting, spend a half hour talking about that chapter, which exposes, first of all, your own cultural presumptions. And the point that Hancock makes is that the average teacher, even a Catholic school teacher, has imbibed so much of the culture that it's unwitting what they're taking for granted, and therefore what's part of the educational process. So I think that's the issue, and you can't take any of this stuff for granted anymore. Sometimes you'll hear, somewhat traditional Catholics say, well, before Vatican II, Catholics didn't divorce, and they didn't have birth control, and they didn't have abortion. Nobody did in the country. Nobody did. It wasn't that Catholics were great people. The whole culture was entirely different. And now that the culture at large is into all of those things, we are in a countercultural position, and that's an entirely different moment. And I think, I'm never quite sure what the Pope is talking about, but missionary disciple, I think is what he means by this, is that we're in a whole different ballgame today.
The idea of Catholic identity and missionary discipleship, as I've heard the two of you talking about it, I don't think they're mutually exclusive of each other. But I think, knowing my own generation, I'm 29 years old, and the other folks in my generation are not inclined to be missionary disciples if they don't know what they're supposed to be talking about. So there's no identity. They have no idea of what their identity is as Catholics. And I think it's like building a house and trying to put the roof up before you have a foundation laid. So I think the identity piece forms, that foundation upon which everything else can be built in that missionary disciple type of manner. But I think, if we start putting the cart before the horse, we're gonna be counterintuitive in what we're trying to do going forward. Because as Father Peter has rightly pointed out, as I've encountered in some of the schools that I've worked in, some of the folks that we have teaching have no idea what it means to be Catholic themselves.
Anybody, yes, sister?
I just want to comment on the responses to this point of the Holy Father's message about the missionary aspect. About 2 weeks ago, we ran a Catholic heart work camp at Charlotte Catholic, 300 students from all over the country, 3 priests, and the purpose of this group is to sign up and prepare to go out and do what the Holy Father suggested, serve the community. And so I saw that gap that you're speaking about in one particular instance, and I've already informed the campus minister of it for next year. They threw in this wrinkle of bringing the people into the school on the final day, whose homes were painted and lawns were cut, and all the work that was done for these poor people in Charlotte. Well, these people all come in, and the gym is full, we're ready to entertain the kids in between. It says now, if you're going to leave now, because we're gonna get loud, and then we're gonna have mass. Well, you just missed the Eucharist, the source and summit. The whole point, as I see what Tom read, is this is your moment now to invite those people who are not even Catholic to be part of this the Eucharist. I mean, the Eucharist is given to us so we can see our brothers and sisters, not just strengthen us, not just nourish us. But I sat there dumbfounded, how we missed this moment. And of course, I don't speak up at the moment because when you're shouting over, like, don't leave, where are you going? Hold-on-us. But I felt that passion, that this is a moment we've missed. So thank you for tying these ends. And there's a number of you that have done it just in the conversation.
Anything else? Well, let's take a break until 11 o'clock, and then we're going to talk about specific priestly role. I mean, that's why I've allowed this to go on, because in some sense this has been overlapping into what we're going to do next. And